On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson gave a speech before a joint session of Congress, asking for a declaration of war against Germany. This was no ordinary case of a country going to war with another. Wilson believed he was launching the world into a whole new age, an age of global democracy. Today, as we watch the shocking events unfolding in Ukraine, we see the world Woodrow Wilson dreamed of and helped construct undergo one of its most difficult tests. Many of us are wondering, will President Biden make a similar speech in the near future? In this video, we'll see what we can learn about our current moment through the cipher of April 2nd, 1917, the day Wilson declared war. We'll start by taking a look at some basic facts about the speech we'll be looking at in this video. It was delivered personally by the President to a joint session of Congress on April 2nd, 1917. And it's important that you understand that before President Wilson, presidents didn't give speeches before joint congressional sessions like we're so used to seeing today. Wilson kind of pioneered this now conventional part of the presidency. In fact, he had an office in the Capitol and spoke to Congress sometimes on a weekly basis. The president had gathered Congress on this occasion to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. But the war itself has been raging in Europe for the past 2.5 years, and President Wilson has been trying to keep the U.S. out of this war the whole time. But now, for reasons which we'll discuss in this video, there has been a change in this policy, and Wilson is now asking Congress to declare war against Germany. Key distinction here. From the War of 1812 until World War II, presidents always ask the Congress to declare war. In fact, more correctly, the president asks Congress to acknowledge a state of war already exists. That way, it's always the other guy who started it. War is always inflicted on the U.S. We're always forced to go in, and this speech will be no exception. Finally, this speech is Woodrow Wilson's most important, and it's considered one of the most important presidential speeches in history. So what are we trying to do in this video? Well, we are going to read through almost the entire speech and analyze how President Wilson uses rhetoric to make his case for war. We'll compare Wilson's speech to what President Biden has been saying since the war in Ukraine began. In particular, we'll be looking at Biden's Warsaw speech from a few weeks ago. We'll read the counter-arguments against Wilson's case for war by looking at what the Germans were saying at the time, and we'll also dive into Putin's justifications for invading Ukraine. We are going to remain as neutral as possible. If you want to watch a video that advocates the rightness of one side over another, there are plenty of videos like that on YouTube. My goal here is to educate you on how presidential rhetoric is used to lead a country into war, not to advance an agenda. I realize real lives are being destroyed every day and families are being torn apart, but this video's mantra will come from one of Wilson's favorite poems, If by Rudyard Kipling, which says, "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, yours is the earth and everything that's in it." And finally, most importantly, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. There are about 80 more videos on here all about history and presidents, so get some Ben & Jerry's and binge all my content. Okay, I think it might be worth briefly reviewing the timeline of events which led to Woodrow Wilson's war speech at this point in the video. It all got started in August 1914, when Germany invaded the sovereign nation of Belgium. Now, a lot of things happened which led up to that, and we'll see Germany argue that it was forced to invade Belgium. But for now, putting ourselves in the shoes of Americans in 1914, that's the story as we are going to see it. Germany's invasion of Belgium opens the western front of the war. President Wilson immediately declares the U.S. neutral. However, in the fall of 1914, President Wilson approves continuing overseas trade to Europe, a huge source of income for the United States, but says that the U.S. will not pick favorites. We're going to trade with everyone. Pretty soon after that decision, Great Britain blockades most of the North Atlantic, preventing American ships from reaching Germany and buying up or confiscating all the supplies. England ends up getting 10 times the supplies Germany gets from the West, and this leads Germany to desperate measures. They start to sink merchant vessels, hoping to disrupt trade and deprive Britain of needed supplies. The downside to this policy is that a lot of American ships and passengers are going to be destroyed by the German submarines, which is going to really anger the United States and increase the likelihood that the US will end its neutrality and enter the war on the side of Britain. Eventually, Germany agrees to pull back on sinking merchant ships. However, with the British blockade choking Germany, it eventually reverses that decision in January 1917 and opens a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare against all vessels in the North Atlantic. Several months later, as scores of ships are sunk in the North Atlantic, President Wilson asks Congress for the declaration of war. The theme of this speech is, "The United States is compelled by the moral force of history to declare war on Germany in order to make the world safe for democracy. We have to join this war. Our character as Americans demands it. And if we don't, democracy itself may not survive." So let's get started now with the opening paragraph of this speech. And here's the text of the speech as it appeared on Wilson's dais the night it was delivered. And it begins, "Gentlemen of the Congress, I have called the Congress into extraordinary session because there are serious, very serious choices of policy to be made, and made immediately, which it was neither right nor constitutionally permissible that I should assume the responsibility of making." And notice the solemnity of this introduction. It really can be considered the calm before the storm. Wilson's rhetoric will become ever more intense as the speech goes on. There are a lot of sources that indicate Wilson was deeply repulsed at the thought of sending American troops into this war, and so he begins the speech here very solemnly, right? "Gentlemen of the Congress, we have serious choices to make." Remember that it's taken Wilson a long time to get to this point. It begins in 1914 with Germany's invasion of Belgium. Here's the front page of the Evening Herald. Germany declares war, all Europe in arms. Germany marches into Belgium. It actually invades Belgium. You can see right here a look at the map as German troops from the east march through Belgium toward France. They're trying to actually trap France and win the war quickly. It was called the Schlieffen Plan. It's a lot like how the current crisis was initiated by Russian troops entering Ukrainian territory from the east, trying to quickly win a victory over Ukraine and bring it to terms. And we'll talk about why both countries initiated these invasions in a little more detail later in the presentation. In our current situation, the US took sides even before the invasion began, and has been imposing heavy sanctions on Russia and trying to isolate it from the world stage. However, this was not the case in Wilson's time. Although American public opinion was shocked by the German invasion of Belgium, President Wilson had declared the United States neutral. And here's a look at a few lines from Woodrow Wilson's Neutrality Declaration in 1914. "The effect of the war upon the United States will depend on what American citizens say and do. Every man who really loves America will act and speak in a true spirit of neutrality. The spirit of this nation in this critical matter will be determined largely by what individuals and society and those gathered in public meetings say, including newspapers and magazines, ministers in their pulpits, and even the opinion on the street." It's going to be especially difficult for Wilson to control opinion on the street, especially as news of Germany's dramatic submarine attacks against merchant ships fill the pages of the world's presses. The 1915 sinking of ocean liner Lusitania, for example, leaves more than 1,000 passengers dead, including hundreds of Americans. And in response to the shocking event, Wilson famously says, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right." Imagine if George W. Bush had said the U.S. is too proud to fight after 9/11. And of course, Wilson receives a mountain of criticism for this speech, including from former president and frequent Wilson critic, Teddy Roosevelt, who says, "We earn as a nation measureless scorn and contempt if we follow the lead of those who exalt peace above righteousness, if we heed the voices of those feeble folk who preach to high heaven that there is peace when there is no peace." Roosevelt became a huge proponent of the U.S. entering World War I. Was he a warmonger? Or was he simply radicalized by being out of power? Teddy Roosevelt had lost the 1912 presidential election to Woodrow Wilson and was considering challenging him again in 1916. No surprise that today we see former President Trump taking extreme and erratic positions on the Ukraine war now that he's out of power, sometimes praising Putin, other times accusing Biden of not showing enough power. What he'd be doing if he were president now, and what TR would have done if he were president then, are things we can't know. But Biden doesn't only have former presidents pushing him to act. The press has been on Biden's case since the first day of the invasion.
Sir, sanctions clearly have not been enough to deter Vladimir Putin to this point. What is going to stop him? How and when does this end? And do you see him trying to go beyond Ukraine? And a second question I'll just give to you now. This statement that he gave last night, the threat that he gave, the West will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. Is he threatening a nuclear strike?
I have no idea what he's threatening. I know what he has done, number one. And number two, no one expected the sanctions to prevent anything from happening. It has to show, this is going to take time, and we have to show resolve so he knows what's coming. And so the people of Russia know what he's brought on them. That's what this is all about. This is going to take time. It's not going to occur. He's going to say, oh my God, these sanctions are coming. I'm going to stand down. He's going to test the resolve of the West to see if we stay together, and we will.
By the time we get to President Wilson's speech on April 2nd, 1917, the president is no longer too proud to fight. And he begins his speech by recapping the events of the last few months that have pushed Wilson to this groundbreaking decision. Wilson refers back to the 3rd of February, when he was giving a speech before Congress about the imperial government's announcement of what was to happen on the first day of February. And what was to happen on the first day of February, according to Wilson, is the German government insisted on putting aside all restraints of law or of humanity and to use submarines to sink every vessel that sought to approach either the ports of Great Britain and Ireland or the western coasts of Europe. Wilson explains that unrestricted submarine warfare had been conducted in a somewhat restrained manner at first. Passenger boats were not sunk, and due warning was given to all vessels. Care was taken of their crew, who were given at least a fair chance to save their own lives. Wilson says that the precautions taken were haphazard, but a certain degree of restraint was observed. However, the new policy has swept every restriction aside. And here's a look at the front page in the New York Times on February 1st. Germany begins ruthless sea warfare, draws barred zones around the Allies. Crisis confronts the United States. And underneath that headline, you can see the text of Germany's note to the U.S. about unrestricted warfare. This note was written by German Ambassador Count Bernstorff. Bernstorff had served in the U.S. for a long time and was well liked in the capital city, initially seen as a voice of reason. But now that he's going to be justifying this unrestricted warfare, he's not going to be so popular anymore, and he'll ultimately be forced to leave the United States. The German embassies will close, and that will be our prelude to war. Now, we'll be looking through this note throughout the video to present the German point of view. So let's take a look now at some of what Count Bernstorff wrote as to why Germany is engaging in unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany puts the blame on the Entente powers. Now, those are Germany's enemies: Britain, France, Russia, the Entente powers. He blames them for announcing an intensified continuation of the war and says that Germany is going to now be compelled to continue to fight for existence, and that this fight has been forced upon it, and the only way it can engage in this fight is by full employment of all its weapons which are at its disposal. Wilson is having none of it. He says that vessels of every kind, regardless of their flag, have been ruthlessly sent to the bottom, both neutral and belligerent vessels. So the Germans are making no distinction between enemy vessels and neutrals, according to Wilson. Even hospital ships carrying relief to the bereaved and stricken people of Belgium have been sunk with a reckless lack of compassion. The sinking of relief vessels to Belgium is especially going to tug at the heartstrings of Americans, who for the last 2.5 years have been following the invasion of Belgium. In many ways, Belgium is going to play the same role in World War I as Ukraine is going to play in our current crisis. Americans donated money and supplies to the relief of Belgians, they welcomed refugees, adopted orphans, and they even flew Belgian flags outside their homes. Today, one doesn't have to go far down the block to see one of those yellow and blue flags flying all around their town. Much as today's news is filled with dramatic and harrowing pictures of blown-up buildings in Ukraine and headlines like Massacre in Bucha and new reports of war crimes, so during the First World War, the news was filled with stories and images of war-torn Belgium, such as this daily sketch front page, honoring the Belgian hero's sacrifice and highlighting German cruelty to the local Belgian peasants. The suffering of Ukrainian non-combatants has comprised a huge part of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's rhetoric in asking the US and NATO for supplies and weapons to fight against the Russians.
Як без обмежень Росія застосовує проти нас увесь свій арсенал, руйнує все живе, будь-які об'єкти, від житлових будинків до церков, від складів з їжею до університетів, від мостів до лікарень. І Україна зверталась до вас по літаки, щоб ми не втрачали стільки людей. І ви маєте тисячі бойових літаків, але нам поки що не дали жодного.
President Biden is employing this rhetoric as well, as evidenced here in his Warsaw speech, which we'll be looking at from time to time throughout this presentation.
And earlier today, I visited your national stadium where thousands of Ukrainian refugees are now trying to answer the toughest questions a human can ask. My God, what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my family? I saw tears in many of the mothers' eyes as I embraced them. They're young children, not sure whether to smile or cry. One little girl said, Mr. President, she spoke a little English, and my brother and my daddy, are they going to be okay? Will I see them again? Without their husbands, their fathers. In many cases, their brothers and sisters who stayed back to fight for their country.
Now, of course, all of this is leaning toward convincing the United States to send war munitions, weapons, ammunition to Ukraine to keep their side of the war going. So if you're taking the Rudyard Kipling approach to this, the keeping my head while all others lose theirs approach, you have to constantly be balancing the news you read about human rights abuses with a due sense of these stories are being told by those in power to increase support for sending weapons to Ukraine, which could help Ukraine win and maintain their sovereignty, but could also risk widening the conflict and causing more damage. So where exactly is that balance? And that is the million-dollar question. For President Wilson, it was enough to stay neutral and merely trade with Europe. After all, the war had created a demand for US goods at a time when the economy was in a slump. The US was selling billions of dollars in goods to Europe. It was creating millions of wage labor jobs in the factories, many of them union jobs. And so many of the unions and even many socialists are later going to support US entry into the war because the war has sustained a progressive workers' economy for so many years. And in many ways, it's the trade that's going to completely destroy President Wilson's attempt at keeping the US neutral because the trade is so one-sided against Germany, but we'll get into that a little later in the video. So what's Count Bernstorff got to say about Belgium, whose misfortune had so galvanized public opinion against Germany? He says, as to Belgium, for which such warm and cordial sympathy is felt in the United States, its annexation had never formed a part of Germany's intention. We have no intention of occupying and conquering Belgium. And he says that Belgium should not continue to be used by Germany's enemies for the purpose of instigating continuous hostile intrigues. Interesting. President Putin, in his war declaration speech, also opted to portray Ukraine as a pawn of larger forces, assuring listeners that his special military operation does not include an indefinite occupation or annexation of Ukraine in its mission.
При этом в наши планы не входит оккупация украинских территорий. Мы никому и ничего не собираемся навязывать силой. Сегодняшние события связаны не с желанием ущемить интересы Украины и украинского народа, Они связаны с защитой самой России от тех, кто взял Украину в заложники и пытается использовать ее против нашей страны и ее народа. Повторю, наши действия – это самозащита от создаваемых нам угроз и от еще большей беды, чем та, что происходит сегодня.
Nevertheless, the images broadcasting out of Ukraine, showing blown-out buildings and ruined towns, have had much more of an impact on galvanizing public opinion than anything Putin could have said in his war speech. Just as no amount of argumentation is going to convince Americans that the Germans have benign purposes toward the Belgian people in its invasion of Belgium. Ultimately, the invasion of Belgium is going to cost Germany dearly in the propaganda war. But what finally pushes President Wilson to declare war is not what's happening in Belgium, but what's happening on the high seas. And that is what he's referring to when he says, "I was unable to believe that such things would in fact be done by any government that had hitherto subscribed to the humane practices of civilized nations." International law had its origin in the attempt to set up some law which would be respected and observed upon the seas, where no nation had right of dominion, and where lay the free highways of the world. Painful stage after stage has that law been built up, with meager enough results, indeed, after all was accomplished that could be accomplished, but always with a clear view at least of what the heart and conscience of mankind demanded. And we're going to see Wilson put himself in the position of being able to tell us what the heart of all mankind demands. It's a very presumptuous thing to do, I would say. This minimum of right, this basic right, is what the German government has swept aside in its policy of retaliation and necessity. And Wilson says that the Germans have claimed that the reason they're doing this is that the only weapons they have are weapons that can fight this way, that can only fight by throwing to the winds all scruples of humanity. He's talking about the German U-boats. He's saying that these weapons, which the Germans have, can only be used in the most inhumane ways possible. And we're looking now at some footage of those German U-boats and how they terrorize the seas. You can see some merchant ships here getting sunk by these U-boats. They would come seemingly out of nowhere, so you might be just kind of enjoying a lovely cruise along the ocean, and then all of a sudden a torpedo strikes your boat and you have no idea where it came from. These things were very sneaky, these U-boats. So let's just go through a couple of basic facts about these deadly weapons that the Germans are employing on the high seas. They're extremely quiet and effective. Germany has 140 of them, which is a lot in this time period. They managed to sink 30% of merchant vessels around Great Britain. So that's a pretty big threat. In 1914, the Kaiser of Germany declares all the waters around Britain a war zone. The next year, the sinking of the Lusitania, which kills over 1,000 passengers, including 128 Americans. The U-boats even sunk American vessels that were parked just off the coast of the United States. So they're coming across the ocean and they're hanging out right off the coast of the US and sinking ships. Now, after the Lusitania, Germany had restricted its U-boat warfare to avoid civilian vessels, but in January of 1917, those restrictions are lifted by Germany. By that point, only about 200 Americans are dead. So it's these vessels which President Wilson says are causing wanton and wholesale destruction of the lives of non-combatants, men, women, children, really building the emotionality here. Wilson says property can be paid for. The lives of peaceful and innocent people cannot be. Thus, Wilson concludes that the war against commerce is actually more than a war against commerce. It's a warfare against mankind itself. You have to keep in mind that for all the disruption of commerce, it's going to take a lot more than sunken supply ships to get the average American on board with joining the absolute mess of war that's happening in Europe. And by this point, only about 200 Americans have died because of German submarine attacks. So Wilson really needs this war to be about something greater than just the loss of property. It's a warfare against mankind itself. Germany, of course, begs to differ. Count Bernstorff begins by insisting that the German Empire has always been devoted to the principles of the freedom of the seas, It's just that Germany's enemies are making that impossible, making it impossible for Germany to respect the freedom of the seas, as it has traditionally done. He talks about a criminal attempt to force Germany into submission by starvation, which has forced Germany to unleash this form of warfare. So it's Britain's fault, according to Germany. Britain has curtailed legitimate trade to Germany, referring to the British blockade, which itself compels neutral countries to pick sides. Who are you going to trade with, Germany or Britain? Whose side are you on? Wilson had said that Germany forced the neutrals to pick a side, but Germany is saying the exact opposite here. Bernstorff even evokes the images of starving women and children, just as Wilson had, who are suffering deprivations due to the British blockade. And that was a fair point. The blockade had caused terrible starvation and deprivation in Germany. Between 478,000 and 800,000 civilians die from diseases related to hunger and malnutrition during this period. From 1916 to 17, we have something called the turnip winter, in which turnips were basically the only vegetables available, so people just ate turnips all winter. Now, Britain is arguing that it must inflict a total war on Germany in order to win. But this puts Wilson in an awkward position as he tries to paint Germany as uniquely bad. And all of this is caused by the British blockade. You can see here a map of the British blockade. Germany is very boxed in from the North Sea here. And so those trade ships are having a hard time getting to Germany anyway, but with this blockade getting in the way, it's going to be nearly impossible. Both sides need U.S. goods during the war. Both sides are living off U.S. trade. Their war effort survives because of U.S. trade. The U.S. trades with everyone. The U.S. economy is boosted, including many jobs, while the U.S. economy is in a slump. That trade ultimately heavily favors Britain and France over Germany. Great Britain makes it even worse by cutting off trade with Germany through the blockade, and starvation grips Germany. But Britain says this is what we have to do to beat Germany. Which brings up this question. Is total war a legitimate form of warfare? Is it legitimate to squeeze the civilian population of a country in order to win? During the American Civil War, the Union Army employed total war to beat the South and free the slaves. In fact, freeing the slaves itself was, at least from the Union point of view, a form of total war on the South, since the Southern economy, including food supplies, relied so heavily on slave labor. This picture here portrays Sherman's March to the Sea, one of the most devastating campaigns in the Civil War, and you can see fire and destruction following Sherman's army wherever he goes. Woodrow Wilson was actually a young boy growing up in Georgia during this time period, and some of his earliest memories include seeing the burnt-out carcasses of buildings and other scars of war. And it's a big reason Wilson endeavors for so long to keep the U.S. out of the war, and why he becomes so enamored with the idea of somehow ending war for all time during his presidency. Now, in addition to all of this devastation, Lincoln also blockades the South. So he prevents the South from engaging in trade with Europe, which is its bread and butter during the war. And the blockade, too, results in bankruptcy, mass starvation, and poverty all across the South, as this little cartoon demonstrates. You can see all the thin people lining up before Jefferson Davis, who looks like a little devil here. Even the dog is thin there. Now, not everyone is that sympathetic to what the South experienced during the Civil War because their cause included the defense of slavery. But you have to ask yourself, how much damage is it okay to deal to an enemy, even if that enemy's cause is abhorrent to you? How many civilians were killed in the Allied bombings of Dresden during the Second World War? Is it okay to kill civilians when you're facing off against the Nazis? Russia has called its own invasion of Ukraine a denazification project. How far will it be willing to go in pursuit of denazification? Well, we're seeing it, and we're probably going to see a lot more of it in the months and years to come. And here's just one more look at that blockade, and you can see all the different red lines represent the trade routes that come in from different parts of the world, and how the British have managed to block all of that trade from Germany at the very time when it needs it most. The next section of President Wilson's war speech continues with the theme of Germany's war against mankind, then talks about the choice all nations must make and what the United States' motives should be in making the decision. It is a war against all nations, Wilson says. American ships have been sunk. American lives have been taken. There has been no discrimination. Friendly and neutral nations have been sunk. It is a challenge for all mankind, which each nation must decide for itself how it will meet. And the choice, as far as Americans are concerned, is going to have to be made with the moderation of counsel and temperateness of judgment befitting our character and motives as a nation. We must put excited feeling away, right? We must be Rudyard Kipling. We need to keep our heads while the rest of the world is losing its. Our motive will not be revenge, but only the vindication of right, of human right, of which we are a single champion. And pay attention to Wilson's focus on unselfishness and the idea of a moral cause. Wilson is starting to make the case that only one type of country, namely a democracy, is suited to go to war for unselfish reasons, such as the preservation of human rights rather than just the raw desire for resources and territory. And we even hear this rhetoric today coming from President Biden during his Warsaw speech.
President Zelensky was democratically elected. He's Jewish. His father's family was wiped out in the Nazi Holocaust. And Putin has the audacity, like all our autocrats before him, to believe that might will make right. My own country, a former president named Abraham Lincoln, voiced the opposing spirit to save our union in the midst of a civil war. He said, let us have faith that right makes might. Right makes might. Today, let us have that faith again.
Of course, Lincoln is a perfect example of a president who uses might in order to achieve his goals. We can argue how much right versus might factored into how the Union won the Civil War, but certainly might is going to be a huge part of it, and it's going to be a huge part of any policy that Biden is going to pursue during this Ukraine crisis, which leaves the floor open for Putin to make the counter-argument. And during his war speech, he's going to portray this idea that the United States represents right over might as completely ludicrous and full of hypocrisy, as we'll later see the Germans are going to do in response to Wilson's speech. Putin here calls the Western Democratic Alliance, NATO, and the US an empire of lies, and explains what he believes is really at the foundation of such an empire.
В основе политики империи лжи, о которой говорил в начале своего выступления, прежде всего лежит грубая, прямолинейная сила. В таких случаях у нас говорят, силы есть, ума не надо. А мы с вами знаем, что настоящая сила в справедливости и правде, которая на нашей стороне. А если это так, то трудно не согласиться с тем, что именно сила и готовность к борьбе лежат в основе независимости и суверенитета, являются тем необходимым фундаментом, на котором только и можно надежно строить свое будущее, строить свой дом, свою семью, свою родину.
Let's hop back to President Wilson's speech again. So we know Wilson believes that the U.S. has no selfish motives. But remember that no matter how outrageous Germany's behavior is going to be, it's still going to take quite a lot of convincing to get Americans on board with going into this absolute hell of a war. So Wilson here takes a moment to address possible alternatives to war and why they will not work. Wilson says that the submarines, when used as the Germans are using them against merchant shipping, are in effect outlaws. And so it is impossible to defend your ship against another ship that is operating illegally. In other words, we're not even following the rules of law, and so these merchant ships can't just go floating through the ocean with a white flag over them because the German submarines are acting in an illegal manner. They are not observing the rules of law. They are acting like privateers or even pirates, we'll see. And so when you're dealing with pirates, you have to shoot on sight. You don't have time to stop and negotiate. And that's what Wilson says, right? These merchant ships, if they're armed, let's say, and they're going to be riding through the North Sea. If they see a U-boat, they have to fire on that U-boat immediately because the U-boat is operating illegally. It is not operating according to the rules of law. They're operating like pirates. And so they don't have time to question whether or not they can negotiate with that ship. And so they have to fire on it. And the Germans are also going to have no choice but to fire on merchant ships because they're going to be containing armed guards that are going to be firing upon them. And so there's no way that armed neutrality could possibly work because it's automatically going to cause a fight, right? If you walk into a bar with a gun, open carry, and if everyone in the bar has guns and everyone's trigger happy, then there's no way you could get from one end of the bar to the other without getting shot. And that's sort of what Wilson is saying. He's saying, we could arm the ships and have them float through the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic and sort of say, like, I dare you to fire at us, but that's going to cause the German ships to fire on them. And so armed neutrality is just as good as getting sucked into the war. So we might as well actually commit ourselves to the war and go for it in earnest rather than trying this half-assed armed neutrality strategy, which is going to suck us in anyway. The armed neutrality policy had been in effect since February 3rd, 1917, and you could see below a front-page headline from the New York Times where they're speculating on how Wilson is going to react to unrestricted submarine warfare. And at first, it's not yet enough to pull Wilson into the war, but after a few months, Wilson ultimately decides there's no living under this German war regime. How are you supposed to cross the ocean teeming with U-boats without getting torpedoed? Clearly, a situation like that is going to affect a lot more than just Europe. It's going to disrupt a vital trade route that the whole world depends on. Of course, the US is the chief beneficiary of that trade route, so it's hard to see it all as unselfish, but maybe that's why Wilson takes such pains to insist that this is a war for democracy and not for property. And this next section here is where President Wilson actually makes the request for a declaration of war. And remember, it's a request for a declaration. Wilson is not declaring war, despite the misleading title of this video. He is not actually declaring war himself. He's asking for a declaration. Wilson says, with a profound sense of the solemn and even tragical character of the step I am taking, he says, I advise the Congress to declare the recent course of the Imperial German government to be, in fact, nothing less than war against the government and people of the United States. That it accept the status of belligerent, we accept it, which has been thrust upon it, and that we take immediate steps to employ all of our resources to bring the German government to terms and end the war. So what is all of this going to involve? He says what this will involve is clear. It's going to involve cooperation and counsel between private and government sectors. The private sector is going to have to extend the most liberal financial credits to the government. There's going to have to be an organization and mobilization of all the material resources of the country. And many of the things that left-wing activists and communists of today would only dream of are going to happen during the Wilson period. Things like the nationalization of public utilities, the nationalization of the railroads. This is a communist's wet dream, and it's all because the United States is going to war. The full equipment of the Navy so that we can build our Navy and face off against these terrible submarines. The immediate addition to the armed forces of 500,000 men. At the end of the day, it's going to be a 4 million man army. Wilson says that they should be chosen on the principle of liability to service. So he's talking about a draft, but he'll call it selective service because A, it sounds better, and B, Wilson wants to selectively pick the best people to fight in the war. In particular, he does not want skilled workers quitting their jobs, sort of patriotically trying to join the war, because he needs them working in the factories and producing the material that he needs in order to fight the war. So he wants to pick the right people. Wilson also calls for the granting of adequate credits to the government, as well as a well-conceived taxation. The burden of taxation is going to increase under Wilson. It already has, as the income tax amendment is passed during the Wilson administration, but now we're going to see a well-conceived taxation to pay for this war. While we do these things, these deeply momentous things, let us be very clear and make very clear to the world what our motives and objectives are. And all of this sacrifice, these heavy taxes, the draft, They are all not just to help us win, but to show the world how pure our motives are, because we're willing to sacrifice so much for the sake of this cause. And what is our motive? To defeat autocracy. This is the motive for which we fight, for which we are willing to completely and fundamentally and irrevocably change our society. Our object now as then is to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world against selfish autocratic powers, which we are in no way one of those. And so we need to engage in a concert of purpose and of action to ensure that these principles of democratic freedom are observed around the world. So this is an early version of the Team America mentality, the world's police. Neutrality is no longer feasible. We've heard that many times in the speech. How could you, why would you remain neutral when autocratic governments backed by organized force are wholly controlling the will of other people and forcing them to attack and to engage in these terrible wars? We have seen the last of neutrality in such circumstances. And here's just a cartoon of the German Kaiser taking a big old bite out of the world, right? Autocracy, it does not just threaten Europe, it threatens the whole world. And here we can also see the Kaiser reaching across to grab the world, and the soldiers beneath him are much smaller here. They are pawns in his game. We also have this idea of the rich man's war, the poor man's fight. These autocratic powers who nobody's asking the people what they think. These autocratic powers are forcing war on common people. There's even this great cartoon, which I love, called The Pals, which shows you one of the German leaders, I guess the Kaiser, kissing Satan here. And that just really reminded me of this famous cartoon of gay Putin, which you can see with the makeup and the rainbow behind him. And of course, this idea that Russia's war against Ukraine is Putin's war and not Russia's war, it keeps the door open to the idea that the Russian people themselves are opposed to this war, except that they are forced into it by a tyrant. And it goes back to this old idea that the US fights wars to preserve freedom around the world.
Today's fighting Kyiv and Metropole and Kharkiv are the latest battle in a long struggle. Hungary, 1956. Poland, 1956, and then again, 1981. Czechoslovakia, 1968. Soviet tanks crushed democratic uprisings. But the resistance continued until finally, in 1989, the Berlin Wall and all the walls of Soviet domination, they fell. They fell. And the people prevailed.
According to Biden, the walls of Soviet domination fall because of the will of the people, the raw will of people to be free, which is stopped by autocracy. What always happens when you list out your grievances against the other country? The other country lists its grievances out against you. And here are some of Germany's grievances against its enemies. And they very adeptly point out the stumbling blocks the United States is going to experience in its heroic attempt to conduct an unselfish war. The US might enter the war for human rights, but its allies have self-interested motives, right? There were secret treaties conducted by Britain and France and Russia as to how they would divide up the spoils of war when all was said and done. So the US might be trying to fight for democracy, but their friends have ulterior motives. And that's going to be a common theme throughout the history of America as a world power, right? Making friends with not so savory characters. One of the allies that the United States is going to team up with is Russia, which is an autocracy. And France and England themselves are vast empires with colonies all around the globe. Britain's blockade is also a human rights abuse, according to Germany. And President Putin has his own laundry list of grievances against the West. He's often talking about how the West routinely flouts international law by invading other states, bringing up the 2003 invasion of Iraq, NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Putin is also voicing concern over Russian-speaking peoples in the Ukraine, especially in the Donbas region. Remember, this all started with Putin recognizing two sovereign countries within the Donbas region of Ukraine. And as of now, Russia is getting very close to gaining control of most of the Donbas region. And so for him, that's another reason why he's justified in going into this territory. Sure, the map might say this is where Ukraine is, but Putin is arguing that in reality, most of the people living there are suffering under Ukraine because they'd rather be part of Russia. And so, in Russian eyes, the West has been the aggressor until now, taking advantage of Russian weakness since the collapse of the Soviet Union to support nationalist governments in a former Soviet space. And this is getting into his denazification justification. NATO expansion into the former Soviet Union is a growing threat to Russia's security, according to Putin. And you can hear it in this answer, which Putin gave to a journalist about a couple weeks before he launched the invasion. Let's listen.
Ну разве мы не знаем? Я же много раз уже об этом сказал. И вы наверняка знаете хорошо. Ни одного дюйма на восток, сказали нам в 90-е годы. Ну и чего? Надули. Просто нагло обманули. 5 волн расширения НАТО. И теперь уже, пожалуйста, в Румынии, сейчас в Польше появляются соответствующие системы. Вот о чем речь. Ну поймите же вы в конце концов. Не мы кому-то угрожаем. Мы что ли пришли туда, к границам США? Или к границам Великобритании? Или куда? К нам пришли. И теперь еще говорят, нет, теперь и Украина будет в НАТО. Значит, и там будут системы. Или, бог с ним, не в НАТО, а на двусторонней основе будут. Базы и ударные системы вооружений. Ну вот о чем идет речь. А вы требуете от меня каких-то гарантий. Вы должны нам дать гарантии. Вы. И немедленно. Сейчас.
What Putin is talking about here is the expansion of NATO. The expansion of a military alliance that is ostensibly an alliance of the democracies of Europe and America. Later, Woodrow Wilson is going to talk about building a league of democracies and why the world must be made safe for democracy. In some ways, NATO, which was created after World War II, is a legacy of this idea. You can see from this map that NATO has, for most of its existence, been firmly planted in the western half of Europe. That's the dark blue colors there. The expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe is something that's really happened since 1999, and most of it has happened during Putin's time in office. Now, people argue over how much Ukraine really had a chance to be accepted into NATO, but considering how many weapons the West is sending to Ukraine, there's clearly at least an informal alliance between Ukraine and the West. I mean, look how deeply Ukraine cuts into Russia there. Belarus, which has been firmly on Russia's side during this entire conflict, is really pushing Putin because, I mean, look where they are. They're going to be right in the middle of a NATO sandwich if Ukraine joins. And that's not a great prospect for their president Lukashenko, who has been in office since 1992. So President Biden finds himself in a much different position than Woodrow Wilson had, defending an already existing network of democracies, or at least so-called democracies, versus fighting to bring one into existence for the first time in history. Look at this map showing American troop presence around the globe today. We are everywhere, and most assuredly all across Europe here. In Wilson's day, America's influence over the world was much more restricted. We did have some recently acquired possessions in the Pacific, but we were totally out of Europe. Now, at times on this channel, when I've talked about this subject, I have accused President Wilson of letting the cat out of the bag in terms of stretching the US military power all over the globe. But you really have to look at the time in which Wilson became president to understand why isolationism was seeing its final days. And there are 3 main factors here, and this goes well beyond Wilson. The western frontier had been closed. In other words, what we think of as the continental United States, from sea to shining sea, east coast to west coast, that had been mostly populated and quote-unquote civilized by this point in time. And so we were no longer plundering our own country for resources and stealing land from the Native Americans by this point, and we were looking for new frontiers to conquer. One of those new frontiers was Atlantic Ocean trade. It becomes much more advanced thanks to technology, better communication, better ships. And so we are trading much more, and the more we trade, the more we depend on Europe, which makes isolation less and less possible. The Panama Canal has just been finished, and so that is going to attract even more European shipping, which means that the United States is going to have to kind of up its game in order not to get steamrolled by all the European powers and their gigantic navies. So the U.S. is really at a point where it has to think, what kind of country are we going to be? Are we going to be a minor country that guards the Western Hemisphere? Or are we going to be a global power? So President Wilson is not forcing the U.S. into the position it's in. The U.S. has already been moving down this path for a long, long time, and many are starting to see entering World War I as the next logical step. In fact, many of those people hate Woodrow Wilson because for the last 2.5 years, Wilson has kept us out of that war. But now all of that has changed, and with that change comes the dawning of a new age. We are at the beginning of an age in which it will be insisted that the same standards of conduct and of responsibility for wrong done shall be observed among nations and their governments that are observed among the individual citizens of civilized states. So Wilson is saying that now that we are becoming a interconnected globe, we are going to have to enforce some kind of standards that all countries will have to be observed, and he says that it has to be the kind of standards that individuals would have to observe. That's an interesting way to put it, because we know that it would be impossible to have an international law that was exactly like regular law, right? We have no quarrel with the German people. This is not about hating Germans, right? We have no ill will towards them. We've got nothing but sympathy and friendship. It was not with their permission that this war was launched. The war was determined upon as wars used to be determined upon in the old dark ages, in the old unhappy days when peoples were nowhere consulted by their rulers, and wars were provoked and waged in the interest of dynasties or of little groups of ambitious men who are accustomed to use their fellow man as pawns and tools. But again, going back to that old counter-argument about hypocrisy, how is the U.S. going to justify joining with Great Britain and France, two massive self-interested empires who did not necessarily ask their populations about joining the war? How are they going to justify joining those countries in a war for democracy? How can it justify joining with Russia? It's one of the oldest autocracies on Earth, 300 years of Romanov Tsars. Were the Russian people themselves not forced into this war by autocrats? Well, lucky for President Wilson, about a month earlier, the Romanov dynasty falls and a revolutionary provisional government takes hold, promising to bring democracy to Russia. So that's really convenient for Wilson. And you can see in the right column on the front page here, there's an article about how Russia's new government will promise freedom and universal suffrage. So the fall of the Romanov dynasty has a huge significance for Wilson's decision to join the war, since it relieves him of having to hypocritically ally himself with one of the most repressive regimes on the planet. And so Wilson sees Russia as more proof that the age of democracy is coming. Does not every American feel that assurance has been added to our hope for the future peace of the world by the wonderful and heartening things that have been happening within the last few weeks in Russia? Russia was known by those who knew it best to have been always, in fact, democratic at heart, in all its vital habits of her thought, in all the intimate relationships of her people that spoke their natural instinct, their habitual attitude toward life. Now keep in mind that Woodrow Wilson knows next to nothing about Russia. And most people in the United States don't know that much about Russia. It was a very mysterious place. And so the idea that he can presumptuously say, well, the Russian people have always been democratic at heart, it doesn't quite line up with what people who study Russia find to be the case. Nevertheless, Wilson claims that the autocracy, the Romanov autocracy, which crowned the summit of her political structure, long as it had stood and terrible as was the reality of its power, was not in fact Russian in origin, character, or purpose. This is clearly connected to the idea that Russian autocracy was exported from Mongolia. So Russia was under the yoke of the Tatars for about 200 years of their existence. And a lot of people in Europe have for years said that the Russian autocracy is sort of an Asiatic thing. It's something that came from the terrible Mongols, not something that civilized Europe would ever countenance. And that's why Wilson, too, is repeating that myth that Russian autocracy was not Russian in origin, character, and purpose, whatever that even means. And now it has been shaken off, and the great generous Russian people have been added in all their naive majesty and might to the forces that are fighting for freedom in the world, for justice, and for peace. Here is a fit partner for a league. In reality, Russia is just going to flounder for the next 9 months, and eventually there's going to be a coup, the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin are going to take over the government, and they are going to issue a separate peace with Germany, which will close the eastern frontier and allow the Germans time and space to launch an even bigger and more horrible offensive on the Western Front. So Wilson is, no pun intended, way out of his league here trying to talk about Russia and the future. But in these weeks, right, people are very caught up by what's happening in Russia. It's kind of like how people got very caught up in the Arab Spring and thought that, democracy was coming to Northern Africa and the Middle East, and that a new age was beginning. And then, of course, many of those countries became failed states or devolved into civil war after that began. Wilson, nevertheless, caught up in the moment, says Russia is a fit partner for a league, an alliance system, which he's going to later propose as the League of Nations. He says that after all this that's happened in Europe, there's going to need to be some kind of partnership among the democratic nations, a league of honor, a partnership of opinion, to contrast with the plottings of inner circles, corruption seated at its very heart. And so Wilson's going to propose a League of Nations where people can discuss their problems openly, and where if a war starts, it's publicly known as to why the war starts, as opposed to these secret intrigues and backroom deals that lead to sending innocent people off to fight the rich man's war, the autocrat's war. Only free peoples can hold their purpose and their honor steady to a common end, and prefer the interests of mankind to any narrow interests of their own. Only free nations can unselfishly prefer the interests of mankind to any narrow interests of their own. Completely leaving out the fact that most of these democratic nations are capitalist in origin as well, and so the capitalism is going to very much determine what the country does, a lot more than public opinion will. But this partnership of peace, this partnership of democratic nations, is going to be essential to Wilson's vision for a peace to end the war and to prevent wars like this from ever happening again. Now, Wilson himself will ultimately fail at achieving these goals, but they will be achieved eventually. We will have a UN, which is kind of a hybrid, much weaker version of the League of Nations. And then there's also NATO, which is a military alliance, and the League of Nations was supposed to have some sort of military alliance engaged in it, but it's also a compromise. It's not exactly what Wilson had envisioned with the League of Nations, where it would be more like the UN with more power. NATO, I guess you could call it, is an alternative to what Wilson wanted, something more like what we had before World War I started, which was an elaborate system of alliances that essentially turned Europe into one giant booby trap. Once set off, it set off all the other traps, kind of like one of those marble traps where it sets off the first one, that sets off the second one, sets off the next one, and that's how we ended up with World War I, and that's how we may end up with World War III if things keep going the way they're going. President Biden is also going to be leaning heavily into this idea of maintaining the integrity of the partnership, the alliances of democratic nations.
And finally, most urgently, we maintain absolute unity. We must among the world's democracies. It's not enough to speak with rhetorical flourish of ennobling words of democracy, of freedom, equality, and liberty. All of us, including here in Poland, must do the hard work of democracy each and every day. My country as well. That's why I came to Europe again this week with a clear and determined message for NATO, for the G7, for the European Union, for all freedom-loving nations. We must commit now to be in this fight for the long haul. We must remain unified today and tomorrow and the day after, and for the years and decades to come. It will not be easy. There will be cost, but it's a price we have to pay, because the darkness that drives autocracy is ultimately no match for the flame of liberty that lights the souls of free people everywhere.
Now back to some more darkness of autocracy. One of the things that has served to convince us that the Prussian autocracy was not and could never be our friend is that it has filled our unsuspecting communities and even our offices of government with spies, set criminal intrigues everywhere. It is a fact that has been proved in our courts of justice. They have disturbed the peace and dislocated the industries of our country under the personal direction of official agents of the imperial government here. And a great example of this is the Black Tom Island attack. It took place on July 30th, 1916. It was a small island off the coast of New York City where there were munitions being held. German agents had managed to blow it up and destroyed 2 million tons of stored weapons. 3 men were killed and 1 baby was actually killed in the attack. It was a huge explosion. Glass shards flew into the Manhattan. Shrapnel pockmarked the Statue of Liberty. This was an unforgettable attack. $20 million in damage. It was not known at the time to be the work of German agents, but it certainly added to the climate of fear at the time. And there were many instances like this. So many instances of German espionage and other things that were going on. Now, to contrast these themes of lies and espionage propagated by the Germans, President Wilson talks about a sense of relief at being able to call things out as they are. He says, "We are glad now that we see the facts with no veil of false pretense. We are free to fight for the ultimate peace of the world, for the rights of nations, great and small. It is a privilege to do so," right? And now the climax of the speech. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion, no indemnities, no material compensation. We will be satisfied when the rights of mankind have been made secure as the faith and freedom of nations can make them. Just because we fight with rancor and without selfish object, seeking nothing for ourselves, but what we shall wish to share with all free peoples, we shall, I feel confident, conduct our operations as belligerents without passion, with proud punctilio, the principles of fair play we profess to be fighting for. I like to call this section of the speech the Happy Warrior because it really reminds me of this poem, The Happy Warrior by William Wordsworth, which was, in fact, one of Woodrow Wilson's favorite poems. Let's just read this quick section. I think it's going to sound eerily similar to what you've been hearing in Wilson's speech so far. Who is the happy warrior? Who is he, that every man in arms should wish to be? It is he who makes his moral being his prime care, who, doomed to go in company with pain and fear and bloodshed, miserable train, turns his necessity to glorious gain. In face of these doth exercise a power, which is our human nature's highest dower, controls them and subdues, transmutes, bereaves, of their bad influence, and their good receives. By objects which might force the soul to abate, her feeling, rendered more compassionate, is placable because occasions rise so often that demand such sacrifice. Sacrifice is a big theme in Wilson's speech here. This next section is kind of a footnote. Woodrow Wilson asks for a declaration of war against Germany, but not against all the powers allied with Germany. We won't go too deep into this section, but suffice to say, Wilson's main gripe with Germany is the disruption of Atlantic trade. He's also going to war for democracy, and not for whatever self-interested reasons these other European empires got dragged into the mess in 1914. The US will actually enter the war not as a full ally of Britain, France, and Russia, but as an associate power, fighting to bring an end to the war and an equitable peace, which is a different reason why Britain and France and Russia are fighting. As Wilson says at the end there, we enter this war only where we are clearly forced into it because there are no other means of defending our rights. Then Wilson returns to the theme of how we should treat Germans. There are a lot of Germans living in the United States at this time. Many of them are supporters of President Wilson. And besides, Wilson is fighting a war against the German autocracy. And he claims the people of Germany don't support the war, so he can't very well go to war against the German people at home. George W. Bush had these same issues after 9/11 when he initiated the war on terror. Wilson says that because we act without animus or enmity towards the German people, but only in armed opposition to an irresponsible government, that's what puts us in a unique position here. We are, let me say again, the sincere friends of the German people. He talks about the millions of men and women of German birth and native sympathy who live among us. They are, most of them, as true and loyal Americans as if they had never known any other fealty or allegiance. Despite what Wilson says in the speech, anti-Germanism is going to be rampant during this period. Many Germans are placed into internment camps for the duration of the war. In media, they are portrayed as mad brutes, especially in films coming out of this hot new California neighborhood called Hollywood. Many Germans are going to be changing their names during the war so that they don't stick out. You can even see this picture here of a local park and the sign says, "Danger to pro-Germans. Loyal Americans, welcome to Edison Park." Now, we don't have this level of Russophobia in the United States yet, but there is definitely a suspicion of everything Russian and has been for a long time. Many stores with Russia in their title have changed their names. Recently, someone threw a brick through the window of a bar called Russia House in Washington, D.C., which is crazy because they have a huge bust of Andrei Sakharov in front of their building, who was a major anti-Soviet dissident, but anyway. We've also seen some congressional representatives talk about sending Russian college students back to Russia. There are also a lot of mostly fake stories about Russian books and movies getting removed from streaming sites and book clubs. It's definitely concerning, but not near the level of what German Americans experienced during World War I. And of course, President Biden is going to make the same appeal to the Russian people. He's going to want to maintain the moral high ground in his rhetoric, because if the United States does end up going to war with Russia, you can bet we'll be going to war for democracy, and that will make the case that Putin has gone to war without Russian people's permission. And here's what we see from Biden in Warsaw.
Which brings me to my message to the Russian people. I've worked with Russian leaders for decades. I sat across the negotiating table going all the way back to Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin to talk arms control at the height of the Cold War. I've always spoken directly and honestly to you, the Russian people. Let me say this if you're able to listen. You, the Russian people, are not our enemy. I refuse to believe that you welcome the killing of innocent children and grandparents, or that you accept hospitals, schools, maternity wards, and for God's sake, being pummeled with Russian missiles and bombs, or cities being surrounded so that civilians cannot flee, supplies cut off, and attempting to starve Ukrainians into submission. Millions of families are being driven from their homes, including half of all Ukraine's children. These are not the actions of a great nation. Of all people, you, the Russian people, as well as all people across Europe, still have the memory of being in a similar situation in the late 30s and 40s. Situation in World War II, still fresh in the minds of many grandparents in the region. Whatever your generation experienced, whether it experienced the siege of Leningrad or heard about it from your parents and grandparents, train stations overflowing with terrified families fleeing their homes, nights sheltering in basements and cellars, morning sitting through the rubble in your homes. These are not memories of the past, not anymore, because it's exactly what the Russian army is doing in Ukraine right now. March 26, 2022, just days before you were a 21st century nation with hopes and dreams that people all over the world have for themselves and their family. Now, Vladimir Putin's aggression have cut you, the Russian people, off from the rest of the world. And it's taking Russia back to the 19th century. This is not who you are. This is not the future you deserve for your families and your children.
So you can really hear echoes of Wilson's war speech here, talking about how autocracy is not natural to the Russian people, but was inflicted upon them. Putin makes a much different appeal to Ukrainians as sharing an историческая родина, or a historical shared homeland. He's making the case that the Ukrainian people are being forced into the war with Russia by the aggression of NATO and the West. So from Putin's frame, NATO is forcing Ukraine into being a proxy against Russia in a larger war. And that's kind of where this denazification stuff comes from. Putin makes the case that he is not going to war against the Ukrainians, but against those who have infiltrated Ukraine and led it down this path which brought us to war.
Должен обратиться и к военнослужащим вооруженных сил Украины. Уважаемые товарищи, ваши отцы, деды и прадеды не для того сражались с нацистами, защищая нашу общую родину, чтобы сегодняшние неонацисты захватили власть на Украине. Вы давали присягу на верность украинскому народу, а не антинародной хунте, которая грабит Украину и издевается над этим самым народом. Не исполняйте ее преступных приказов. Призываю вас немедленно сложить оружие и идти домой. Поясню. Все военнослужащие украинской армии, которые выполнят это требование, смогут беспрепятственно покинуть зону боевых действий и вернуться к своим семьям. Еще раз настойчиво подчеркну. Вся ответственность за возможное кровопролитие будет целиком и полностью на совести правящего на территории Украины режима.
What we've seen in the last month has shown us that most Ukrainians have not accepted Putin's offer to allow Russia to cleanse it of Nazis, just like the Belgians wouldn't permit the Kaiser to borrow its land to attack the French and put up a fierce resistance when the Germans marched in. Whether the US ends up getting involved directly will depend greatly on how well the Russian offensive is contained within Ukraine and doesn't spill over into any NATO countries. Wilson continues, "It is a distressing and oppressive duty, gentlemen of the Congress, which I have performed in thus addressing you. There are, it may be, many months of fiery trial and sacrifice ahead of us." Fiery trial is a Abraham Lincoln quote there. "It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance." And there was an interview that came out many years later that was taken just before Wilson made this speech, in which Wilson was talking to the editor of the New York World, Frank Cobb, and he seemed desperate. He told Cobb he had considered every loophole, every possible way that he could get out of going to war with Germany. He says in the interview, "Once lead this people into war," and this is very prophetic, "they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter the very fiber of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street." He thought the Constitution would not survive the war, that free speech and the right of assembly would go. He said a nation couldn't put its strength into a war and keep its head level. So much for Rudyard Kipling. It had never been done. "If there's any alternative, for God's sake, let's take it," Wilson exclaimed. "But the right is more precious than the peace," Wilson says in his speech. "And we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest to our hearts." And here's all of our war aims. "For democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right, a concert of free peoples that shall bring peace and safety to all nations," the League of Nations. He says, "To such a task we can dedicate our lives and our fortunes, and that America is privileged to spill her blood and her might for the principles that gave her birth and happiness and the peace which she has treasured." And then, quoting Martin Luther, he finishes, "God helping her, she can do no other."
In the perennial struggle for democracy and freedom, Ukraine and its people are in the front lines, fighting to save their nation. And their brave resistance is part of a larger fight for an essential democratic principles that unite all free people. The rule of law, fair and free elections, the freedom to speak, to write, and to assemble, the freedom to worship as one chooses, freedom of the press. These principles are essential in a free society. But they have always been under siege. They've always been embattled.